Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you with us today because we are diving into a truly fascinating intersection of criminal law, physical science, and behavioral psychology. We often hear about the digital footprints we leave behind, right? And the legal ramifications of our online actions. But it is incredibly rare to see a single case so perfectly illustrate the friction between how a rigid legal institution views the world and how science, specifically physics and psychology, interprets that exact same reality. Today we're unpacking the documented case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan.
So, think about this. Can a simple retweet actually cause a social avalanche? That's the core question we're going to explore today. We're going to test this exact premise using two radically different frameworks derived from our source material. On one hand, we have a judicial system that says, absolutely, a single digital click can shatter public order. But, on the other hand, we have a scientific defense arguing that, according to the mathematical laws of complex networks and human behavior, it's virtually impossible. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the arrest and charges. Let's lay out the undisputed facts of what actually happened here. Dr. Chen Jingyuan is a researcher with a PhD in physics who spent decades studying complex systems. Looking at the timeline, between July 2019 and April 2022, Dr. Chen used a VPN to sporadically retweet and engage with posts on a social media platform. Fast forward a bit to September 2022. Police arrive at his home, conduct a search, arrest him, and confiscate his digital devices. And the legal system processed this incredibly fast. By April 2023, following a closed-door trial, he was convicted and sentenced to 1 year and 8 months in prison. Barely a month later, his appeal was dismissed without a hearing.
So what exactly was he convicted of? Well, the specific criminal charge brought against Chen by the prosecution was picking quarrels and provoking trouble. The prosecution alleged that Chen knowingly spread and disseminated fake information on the internet and that these actions caused a severe disruption and confusion of public order.
Moving right along to Section 2, the legal arguments.
When you look closely at this digital timeline, you basically see two completely parallel realities. The prosecution argued that the posts Chen interacted with were strictly fake information, that he deliberately spread them, and that this inherently caused severe public disorder. But the defense pushed back. They argued that these posts, which included things like political cartoons, historical commentary, and emotional expressions, were subjective art or academic opinions. They don't really have a strict true or false scientific standard. Plus, they argued Chen was simply engaging in passive, one-click retweeting with zero malicious intent, and that absolutely no actual disruption of public order ever occurred.
So, how did the court resolve this conflict? Well, they convicted him. And the judgment's reasoning is super interesting. It explicitly stated that because the defendant has a high educational background and a high level of knowledge, he should be able to distinguish right from wrong. In other words, the legal system interpreted Chen's advanced academic background as direct proof of his subjective intent. Because he is highly educated, the court figured he must have known the information was problematic, which makes his retweeting a deliberate provocation. That brings us to Section 3, network dynamics and order.
Now, Chen didn't just argue his case using standard legal precedent, he actually used science to challenge the entire foundational concept of public disruption. To define disruption, the defense turned to something called avalanche dynamics. This is a really fascinating physics concept where a seemingly minor event in a complex, scale-free network, like a massive social media platform, triggers a huge cascading collapse. Think of a single snowflake triggering an avalanche, or what physicists call a self-organized critical state. The prosecution claimed Chen caused a severe disruption, right? Which in physical terms means they were claiming his actions triggered a social avalanche.
But here is where the math comes into play, and it's pretty wild. Less than 100. This number is absolutely crucial. It represents both Chen's total follower count, many of which were just inactive accounts anyway, and his total number of retweets over a span of almost 20 years.
So the defense argued that in the science of network dynamics, an avalanche actually requires a critical mass to trigger that cascading branching process. Chen was what physicists refer to as an edge node, basically a tiny isolated point on the absolute outer fringe of the network. Using the Galton-Watson extinction theorem, the defense argued mathematically that a node with under 100 connections operating in a subcritical state physically lacks the capacity to trigger an avalanche. It just can't happen. Therefore, from a scientific standpoint, the claim of severe public disorder was mathematically impossible.
Let's shift gears a bit. Section 4, the behavioral psychology lens.
Okay, so we're moving from physics over to psychology now. We're going from analyzing the physical result of the retweets to analyzing the psychological intent behind them. How does behavioral psychology explain why Chen retweeted in the first place and why the court punished him for it? Well, behavioral psychology, rooted in the classic work of Pavlov and Skinner, focuses on observable behavior shaped by our environment. Let's briefly recap the core mechanisms here. You have a stimulus, which triggers a response. If that response is followed by a reward, that's reinforcement, meaning you're more likely to do it again. But if it's followed by a negative consequence, that's punishment, which is designed to make the behavior stop.
This clash of conditioning beautifully illustrates the real conflict at the heart of this case. You see, every single person is shaped by their own reinforcement history. Chen spent decades as a scientist. His academic reinforcement history rewarded him for gathering diverse data, questioning the norm, and exploring multiple viewpoints. This naturally drove his exploratory behavior online. The court, on the flip side, operates on an institutional reinforcement history. They are deeply conditioned to identify threats, maintain order at all costs, and penalize deviations. This drives their risk avoidance behavior.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, Institutional Reinforcement. This brings us to how two completely different systems can process the exact same digital behavior entirely differently, all depending on their internal conditioned scripts. Our sources highlight a really vital observation here. The friction between institutional scripts and individual academic traits results in ignoring the value of positive personality traits. Think about it. In the scientific world, curiosity, open-mindedness, gathering information, those are highly positive traits. But when you place them under the microscope of a strict legal institution, these exact same traits get completely stripped of their positive context.
So the big takeaway here is that the judicial system's negative reinforcement framework just isn't designed to understand curiosity. It views exploratory academic behavior, like bookmarking or retweeting an opposing viewpoint, solely through a penalizing lens. It interprets a genuine attempt to learn or observe as an intentional, malicious threat to order. It's essentially a complete breakdown in behavioral communication between two different worlds.
All right, let's wrap this up in Section 6, a clash of systems.
Let's bring all these incredible threads together. Because ultimately, this case isn't just about one man and a social media account. It is fundamentally about a clash of massive systems. On one side, we have the institutional system. It's driven by risk avoidance, and it views the digital action as a disruption and a threat. Opposite that, we have the scientific system. It's driven by curiosity, and it views the exact same action as an exploratory process performed by a mathematically insignificant edge node. The exact same behavior is processed in two completely different ways, depending entirely on the conditioning of the system that's looking at it.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to ponder today. What happens when a scientific worldview collides head-on with a rigid institutional script? In the case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan, we saw exactly what the outcome is. And it really forces us to ask how society should balance the academic need to explore the world with the institutional desire to control it. Thank you so much for joining me today on this deep dive into the fascinating mechanics behind human behavior, networks, and the law. Keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next explainer.